Well, hey, welcome to the bonus content. We talked about anger this past week because Jesus, he went to places that we don't always like to talk about. And I think anger hit a sensitive spot for a lot of people in our church as I was talking with them and messaging with them. And you know, anger crops up in so many areas of our life that if we're not careful, it can completely consume us. And so if you remember, if you haven't yet watched that message, make sure you go back. We used the Hulk hands to illustrate the power of anger in our life. And I'm a former youth pastor, so I always have to use the visuals and think about how we can illustrate God's word. But if you remember this past Sunday, this past weekend, we looked at this idea that while you and I may not struggle with the sin of murder, we're not thinking about taking someone's life. What we do really struggle with is anger. And remember, a lot of the things we're going to talk about today for just a moment is this idea that we're trying to erase someone from our memory. And that's what murder is. Murder is eliminating someone. And while you and I, again, may not maybe physically do that, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, we do that all the time. And so here's what I want to talk about today. I mentioned these very briefly in our message time. We looked at primarily the antidote of anger. Remember, a calm spirit, an understanding heart, having a selective attitude. But I want to back up and I want to look at for just a moment and think through scripturally from the Bible what it looks like with these appearances of anger. I just went through these very quickly. And by the way, everything that we do, everything that you hear from me or from any of our speaking pastors always needs to be grounded in God's word, because you don't just do things because I say it or because Pastor Ken or another pastor says it. We do it because of God's word. And so the Bible talks about testing the spirits and making sure that it's accurate and biblical. And so the things I want to share with you today are from the Bible as we consider this idea of avoiding some appearances of anger. And if you remember, we looked at the first one we looked at in depth was silent treatments and cold shoulders. Now, this is a big one because it's not so obvious. It's this inward, really hatred, honestly, this inward anger toward those who have really wronged us. And the deceptive part of cold shoulders and silent treatments is that they seem very justified to us. Maybe someone sent a rude email that they didn't mean to copy us on. And so now we feel justified in lashing out and retaliating against them. Or maybe they texted, maybe accidentally, someone that they thought, but they texted you. And so now you feel grieved in your spirit because they were rude to you. And we feel justified. So many times what we do is we give people the silent treatment. We ignore them. We reject them. But as we looked at in our message, that is the same as erasing somebody. Now, I want to read a passage to you in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. I'm going to read two verses to you that Paul writes, and here's what I want you to think about as I read these. Think about where cold shoulders and silent treatments fit in this passage, because Paul's going to give us a little bit of some advice of how we treat people around us. Here's what he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14. He says, "And we exhort you." That word just means to encourage you. Here's some instruction for you. He says, "We exhort you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle, those who are lazy, comfort the discouraged, help the weak, be patient with everyone." Now think about those key words. He mentions comfort, he mentions help, and he mentions to be patient. Now those don't sound like to me that they are cold shoulders and silent treatments. But then he goes on to say in verse 15, "See to it." Now this is the key part. "See to it that no one repays evil for evil to anyone." Now what is a silent treatment and what's a cold shoulder? It is trying to repay evil for evil. Now, you might think that because it's not affecting them, that it's okay. But let me tell you, this is affecting you so much. And so we don't repay evil for evil. But then he says this, as he closes out this verse, he says, "Always pursue what is good for one another and one for all." Now, think about the other side of the cold shoulder or silent treatment. When you're being the one that's being shunned and pushed away, how does that make you feel? You feel rejected. You feel like no one is caring for you. And that's how that person that you're trying to avoid feels as well. So the first appearance, the big appearance of evil for us, in anger rather, is silent treatments and cold shoulders. But there's another way that you and I can have anger kind of sprout up in our life. And we find this one has grudges and avoidance. Now, we looked at this in our message, but this is like level 2 anger, where level 1 is more like internal, like we just don't really have we're not really approaching them, we're just ignoring them. And so in our mind, we feel like that's okay. Now we're stepping it up, where we're having an active grudge, or we are maybe purposefully, and even trying to show them that we're avoiding them. Now this one's not, it's a little bit more obvious. It's a little bit more where we're like, I'm really upset with you, and I don't care if you know that I'm upset with you. Now the silent treatment, we might want them to know that we're upset with them, but we're not gonna go approach them, because we think that we're better. Remember, anger provides us this platform of superiority because you wrong me, now I'm going to wrong you, and I'm completely and perfectly justified. But Jesus is saying, hey, you have to get rid of all of that anger. Anger cannot rule in your heart. Now, I'm going to read a verse to you in Romans chapter 12, and this is Paul again writes this, and look what he says. And you're going to see another phrase that we just read. He says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. So there's that phrase again. But then he says this, give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes. When you think about this idea of having a grudge against someone, and by the way, this sometimes is against family. Maybe it's against a brother for decades. Maybe it's a sister. Maybe it's against an aunt or an uncle or some extended family that we know of that we are just holding this grudge against because, maybe they didn't support you when you're getting married, or maybe there's some things that they just weren't on board with you, and you've been holding this grudge for years. Do you know what that affects the most? It affects you. Anger just is this cancer that goes inside our body and just begins to eat us up from the inside out, and it begins to consume us. So when we see these appearances of evil, even as little offshoots and sprouts, we've got to be careful to completely get rid of them and to have that calm spirit, that understanding heart, to be selective of those who are around. And so when we think about cold shoulders and silent treatments, those are obvious. We've got to stop doing that. Number one, it's childish. And remember, we looked at this idea that when we show our anger, we're showing off our foolishness. And we don't want to show off things that are immature, things that really are embarrassing. And we want to show off Jesus. We want to show off the right way that we treat people. But when we have grudges and we avoid people, we're just showing off some spiritual immaturity that we need to ask God to help us grow through. But there's a final appearance that I want to share with you, and it's a little bit more obvious than these first two. And then the last one we find is slander and ill will. This is where we're taking an active approach to really trying to put down that person that we're so angry with. And Paul, again, he writes to another church, this time in Ephesus, and here's what he says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31. He says, let all bitterness, let all anger, let all wrath, shouting, and slander be removed from you along with all malice. Now, all of these have really a beginning or an origin in anger, in this attitude that we are upset with those. And so what we need to be careful of, whether it's on social media, whether it's through the phone, through texting, whether it's through an email, whether it's just through conversation with people, we cannot allow slander and ill will to control our life. Now, I'm sharing all these things with you because anger is such this thing in our life that if we're not careful, it's like those weeds. I've mentioned before, I have a lawn that is primarily weeds and not as much grass. And here's what I found. If I am not careful with those weeds, if I'm not pulling them out, and if I'm not maybe trying to use weed spray, or I'm actively trying to remove those weeds, you know what happens? Those weeds completely dominate and take over the lawn in my case, and it can dominate and take over your life as well. Anger is like these weeds of the soul that if we're not careful, if we're not asking daily sometimes, Jesus, maybe even hourly, Jesus, I'm going to a meeting. Jesus, I'm meeting with some family members. Jesus, I'm meeting with this person that's wronged me. If we're not careful, if we're not actively getting rid of those weeds, it completely dominates us. And just like we talked about in our message, what happens is we put on these whole cans and they destroy our life. And this makes a cool comic book character, but it makes a terrible way of living. And so put down the whole cans this week. Avoid these appearances of evil so that God can use you and can get rid of the weeds of anger so that you'll live this free life, this abundant life. I had somebody this past Sunday, and I'll close with this. They were telling me after one of the services, they said, man, the Sermon on the Mount is kicking my butt. And I remember thinking, and I was agreeing with her of thinking, yeah, like this is such a countercultural, against the world view of how to live that it is very hard when we think about, man, I got to be a peacemaker. I've got to have joy in persecution. Man, I've got to live in a way that is different than what the world is calling us to live. And by the way, we're only in the first third of this message. There's so many more things we're going to cover over the next upcoming weeks and even couple of months. But let me tell you that Jesus' way is harder, but Jesus' way is better. And so let me encourage you this week to get rid of the anger, put the whole cans down, and let's live in a way that would reflect and show off who Jesus is. Thanks for watching. Can't wait to see you next time.